There's a moment that changes everything for an empath. Not a breakdown, not a confrontation, not a dramatic exit, just a quiet decision that reverberates through their entire energy field. They stop explaining. Not because they don't care, not because they've given up, but because they've finally realized something most people will never understand. Every time you explain yourself, you leak power. Every time you justify your boundaries, you weaken them. Every time you defend your truth, you give others permission to judge it. The empath who stops explaining isn't becoming cold, they're becoming untouchable. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon better than anyone. He observed that people who constantly explain themselves are operating from what he called the wounded mirror archetype. They're reflecting everyone else's reality back to them while erasing their own. They've learned that their feelings, needs, and perceptions are only valid if others approve of them. So they explain, they clarify, they justify, they perform emotional labor for people who will never meet them halfway. And one day, without warning, they stop. This video isn't about empowerment cliches, it's about the psychological architecture beneath that shift. What happens in your nervous system when you stop over-explaining, why people react with shock, anger, or accusations when you stop performing, and most importantly, what it actually means to become untouchable without losing your capacity for connection. If your first instinct right now is to defend why you explain yourself, that's the response we're dissecting. Stay, because what I'm about to show you isn't criticism, it's liberation, and you're closer to it than you think. Let me be surgical about where over-explaining comes from, because it's not a personality trait. It's a survival adaptation that formed the first time your reality was invalidated. Maybe you were 7 years old and you said you were hurt and someone told you that you were too sensitive, that your perception was wrong, that your feelings were an overreaction. So you learned, my truth isn't enough on its own. I need to prove it. I need to make them understand. Or maybe you were 15 and you set a boundary and it was met with anger, guilt, or withdrawal. So you backtracked, you explained, you softened. You turned your boundary into a negotiation because keeping the peace felt safer than standing your ground. Or maybe you were 23 and someone you trusted accused you of something you didn't do, and instead of letting their misunderstanding exist, you spent hours explaining, defending, providing evidence. Because the idea that someone could think poorly of you without your consent felt unbearable. Whatever the origin, your nervous system learned the same lesson. Silence is dangerous. Unexplained decisions are selfish. Boundaries without justification are cruelty. And here's what nobody tells you about that adaptation. It works for a while. People accept your boundaries when you dress them up in apologies. They respect your no when you give them 5 reasons why. They stop pushing when you perform enough emotional labor to make them comfortable with your discomfort. But the cost, you've trained them to expect an explanation for everything. You've given them access to your internal world and now they believe they have a right to it. And more insidiously, you've trained yourself to believe that your truth isn't valid until someone else approves it. Research on trauma responses confirms this. Over-explaining is a learned survival strategy triggered by fear of being misunderstood, dismissed, or rejected. When you've experienced emotional invalidation repeatedly, your nervous system associates silence with danger, so it pushes you to fill the space with words to preemptively defend yourself, to earn the right to exist without conflict. Jung would call this shadow work that hasn't been integrated yet. You're operating from the wounded part of yourself that still believes, I'm only acceptable if I make myself understandable. I'm only worthy if I can prove I'm not the villain. But here's the truth that will set you free. You don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting yourself. You don't owe anyone a breakdown of your internal process. You don't owe anyone proof that your boundaries are reasonable. The moment you stop explaining is the moment you reclaim the power you've been giving away one justification at a time. So what actually happens the day you stop explaining yourself? First, people panic. Not everyone, but the people who have been feeding off your emotional labor, the ones who have gotten used to you justifying, softening, performing, they'll feel it immediately, and they won't like it. You'll set a boundary and say nothing else. No apology, no explanation, no I'm sorry but I just need to, just no I'm not available, or that doesn't work for me, or I'm stepping back. And they'll push, they'll ask why, they'll demand to know what changed, they'll accuse you of being different, cold, distant. They'll say things like, you never used to be like this. Why are you being so harsh? You owe me an explanation. And here's the moment that determines everything, what you do next. The old you would cave, would explain, would perform, would turn your boundary back into a negotiation to prove you're still the good one. The untouchable you stays silent, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect. Because you've realized something they haven't. boundaries that require explanation are negotiations, and you're done negotiating your right to protect yourself. Second, your energy stabilizes. This is the part most people don't expect. When you stop leaking power through constant explanation, you feel it physically. Your chest loosens, your shoulders drop, that chronic low-grade anxiety that comes from constantly managing other people's perceptions of you, it starts to dissolve. You stop rehashing conversations in your head, wondering if you said the right thing. You stop bracing for misunderstanding. You stop performing a version of yourself that's palatable to people who never cared about your actual truth. Jung called this integration, when your internal reality and external behavior finally align. You're no longer split between who you are and who you think you need to be for others to accept you. And people feel it not consciously, but energetically. You've stopped being available for the game. You've stopped offering yourself up for debate, and that shift, that quiet, unshakable self-possession, makes you untouchable. Third, people reveal themselves. This is the part you need to be ready for, because when you stop explaining, you'll see exactly who was there for you versus who was there for what you could provide. The people who respect you will accept your boundaries without demanding a dissertation. They'll say, "Okay, I understand," and they'll move on. They might be disappointed, but they won't punish you for it. The people who don't respect you will escalate. They'll guilt trip. They'll accuse you of changing. They'll tell you that you're being unreasonable, unfair, cruel. They'll demand explanations, then reject whatever you say, because it was never about understanding you. It was about controlling you. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people will leave, not because you did anything wrong, but because they can't operate in a dynamic where you're no longer performing emotional labor for them, where you're no longer managing their reactions, where you're no longer shrinking to keep them comfortable. Let them leave. That's not loss, that's clarity. Here's what most people don't understand about over-explaining. Every time you justify yourself, you're unconsciously communicating that your decision is up for debate. Let me give you an example. You tell someone, "I can't come to that event." That's a complete sentence. It's a boundary, it's clear. But then you add, "I'm just really overwhelmed with work right now, and I haven't been sleeping well, and I promised myself I'd rest this weekend, and I know that sounds bad, but I really need the time alone." What just happened? You didn't strengthen your boundary, you weakened it, because now you've given them 5 different angles to argue with. They can say, "But you're always working, you need a break," or "This will be relaxing," or "You can rest next weekend." And suddenly your boundary has become a negotiation, and you're losing. Psychology Today published research showing that boundaries lose power when we justify them. The justification signals, "This decision is conditional. It depends on whether my reasons are good enough. It's subject to your approval." But when you simply say, "I can't come," and stop talking, there's nothing to argue with. You've stated your reality. It's not a debate, it's information. Jung would frame this as the difference between operating from the ego versus operating from the self. The ego needs approval, validation, understanding. The self simply is. It doesn't need to explain itself because it knows its own truth is the only permission it needs. And here's the most important part: the discomfort you feel when you don't explain. That's not evidence that you're doing something wrong. That's your nervous system experiencing withdrawal from a pattern it's relied on for years. It feels wrong because it's unfamiliar, because you've been conditioned to believe that silence is cruelty, that withholding explanation is withholding love, that if you don't make people comfortable with your boundaries, you're being selfish. But let me ask you this: whose comfort have you been prioritizing, theirs or yours? And how much longer are you willing to betray yourself to keep others comfortable with your betrayal? But I need to be honest about something most empath content ignores. There's a shadow side to becoming untouchable, and if you're not aware of it, you'll weaponize this shift without realizing it. There's a difference between not explaining yourself and withholding communication to hurt someone. If you're going silent specifically to make someone feel what you felt, to watch them squirm, to punish them for not understanding you, that's not power. That's revenge with a spiritual makeover. Real boundaries come from self-respect, not contempt. If you can't tell the difference yet, you're not ready. Going silent isn't the same as setting boundaries. Some empaths stop explaining because they've stopped communicating altogether. They've confused boundaries with walls. They've turned "I don't owe you an explanation" into "I don't owe anyone anything ever." That's not untouchable, that's unreachable, and there's a massive difference. You start looking at people who still explain themselves and feeling superior. You think they're weak, they're codependent, they haven't woken up yet. But 2 years ago, that was you. And until you can hold compassion for people who are still in that pattern, you're not integrated. You're just operating from a more sophisticated version of the same wound. You stop explaining yourself, but not because you're sovereign, because you want to see who passes your test, who stays when you stop performing, who proves they love the real you. But here's the problem, that's still making other people responsible for your sense of safety. You've just flipped the script from "I need to prove I'm worthy" to "they need to prove they're worthy." Both are ego, neither is self. If you recognize yourself in even one of these, good, that means you're being honest, and honesty is the only way through. Jung said, what you don't integrate, you project, and your untouchability will either be sovereignty, or it will be a more polished version of the same protective mechanism that's kept you isolated for years. The difference is in your intention. Are you protecting your peace, or are you punishing people for past wounds? Are you setting boundaries, or are you hiding? Are you sovereign, or are you superior? Only you know, and if you can't answer that question without defensiveness, there's your answer. So how do you actually do this? How do you stop explaining yourself without losing your humanity? Vars. Not explaining doesn't mean not communicating. You can still say, "I'm not available," without adding, "because of 17 reasons that you might approve of." You can still say, "That doesn't work for me," without justifying why. You can still say, "I'm stepping back," without proving you have the right to. Communication is information. Explanation is justification. Learn the difference. Second, when someone asks why, and your nervous system screams to explain, pause, count to 5, feel the discomfort, then choose, do I want to share this, or do I feel obligated to? If it's obligation, just say, "It's just what I need right now," and stop talking. If it's genuine desire to share, share, but from choice, not compulsion. Third, this is the hardest one. Someone misunderstands you, thinks you're being unfair, thinks you've changed, and every instinct in you wants to correct their perception. Don't let them think what they think. Their misunderstanding of you is not your emergency. Their discomfort with your boundaries is not your responsibility to fix. You are not obligated to make people comfortable with your growth. Fourth, when someone demands an explanation, try this. "I understand you want more information, but my decision stands." Or, "I hear that this is confusing for you, but I'm not going to explain further." Or simply, "I've said what I'm going to say." And then this is critical, stop talking, don't fill the silence, don't soften it, don't perform discomfort, just let it be. Well, your body will tell you that not explaining equals rejection, that silence equals cruelty, that holding your ground equals being the villain. That's your trauma talking, not your truth. The discomfort you feel is withdrawal from a pattern that's kept you safe but small, and the only way through it is to tolerate it without acting on it. Breathe, ground, stay, and watch what happens when you don't abandon yourself to keep others comfortable. Here's what untouchable actually means. It doesn't mean no one can hurt you. It means no one can make you abandon yourself. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about your peace more than their approval. It doesn't mean you're closed off. It means you're no longer open to people who require you to shrink. The empath who becomes untouchable hasn't lost their empathy. They've just learned where to direct it. And for the first time in their life, they're directing it inward first. Jung spent years teaching this. You cannot become whole by making yourself acceptable to others. You become whole by integrating the parts of yourself you've been exiling to keep the peace. And one of those parts, the part that doesn't owe anyone an explanation, the part that says no without softening it, the part that lets people be disappointed without managing their emotions. That's not cruelty, that's sovereignty. And it's the only path to the kind of peace that doesn't require constant performance. The day you stop explaining yourself, everything shifts. Not because you've become cold, but because you've finally chosen yourself with the same conviction you used to choose everyone else. People will call it growth, some will call it change, a few will call it cruelty. Let them, you're no longer available to debate your right to exist on your own terms. You've become untouchable, not because you've closed your heart, but because you've finally stopped giving people access to it who were never safe to begin with. And that's not loss, that's clarity, that's power. That's the empath who finally learned your truth doesn't need their permission.